Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things CoS of Strahd and Ravenloft. Today we're going to be talking about a Ravenloft NPC, so I suppose it's more of a Ravenloft video, although I do know of some DMs who have included this character we're going to talk about today in their CoS of Strahd campaign, so I guess it's kind of both. The next few videos I want to do include deep dives into the domains of Dementlieu and Valachan. But I wanted to today I wanted to start talking about some of the NPCs in Ravenloft. I have plans to do a video on Firanz Alhonen, or I think it might be pronounced Firon. We'll worry about that when we get to that video. Gondogor from Folkovnia and Shadowlands fame. The Weatherme Foxgrove twins. Esmeralda Davenir, or Ez for short as she is known in Van Richten's Guide. But firstly, I really wanted to cover, for the first one of these videos, my favourite NPC from Ravenloft entirely, Jander Sunstar, the good vampire. So this video isn't going to be like a sort of deep dive lore video. There's other sources for that, including another great video which I'll talk about in a bit. What I'd like to do is kind of talk about him briefly, but also talk about things that maybe aren't in other sources and videos, such as how I roleplayed him. There was a bit when my players met him where he gave like a very short, it was like a mini cutscene, sort of like a story where he explains that he ended up in Barovia for a time and so on. I wanted to talk about stat blocks. One is suggested in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, but I have a few ideas of some others that could work instead. How I ran him in my game, so he appeared in Dementlieu, and I'm thinking of having him show up in either the Shadowlands or Forlorn, or both. And lastly, we will be covering his slightly controversial cameo in another 5th edition adventure, Descent into Avernus. If you know, you know. If you don't, then obviously you don't. I don't know why I said that. But if you are hoping to play Descent into Avernus one day, then maybe don't watch this video. And if you're going to play a Ravenloft campaign or anything like that, or CoS of Strahd, maybe don't watch this video either. Okay, firstly, let's talk about sources of where you can find out information for Jander. So there's some introductory information in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. The Forgotten Realms wiki has some great information on him. There's also the Ravenloft wiki and the Fraternity of Shadows wiki and website. All three of those have great chunks of information on him. In terms of novels, he is the protagonist in Vampire of the Mists, written by Christie Golden. You may recognise that the name of this channel may or may not be named as a homage to Vampire of the Mist, DM of the Mist. You see what I did there? And I don't want to say too much about this story, because if you haven't read it, if you read it, you know already. If you haven't read it, I would much rather you read it for yourself and get a feel for it. It's available as an audiobook and I believe on Kindle as well, if you're unable to get hold of the physical paperback copy. So you should still be able to read it. It's a great book. I've read a bunch of the Ravenloft novels. I've been meaning to do a Reddit post talking about what I thought of them all. Only the ones that are available on Kindle, so not all of them, probably like half, 2/3 of them. And I think Vampire of the Mist was probably my favourite. He also appears in a bunch of short stories, which I haven't actually read. As far as I know, they're not available on Kindle. They are available on Audible, so audiobook. I'm not an Audible member, and so if I were to buy them, I'd have to buy them individually, and they're quite costly. Maybe I should sign up to Audible just to listen. You can't like listen to just individual chapters, you have to get the whole book. Although, some of the other stories look good, and I think everyone contains at least one Drizzt story. The stories by R.A. Salvatore. So, you know, you get Jander, you get Drizzt, and a bunch of other stories. So there's one called One Last Drink that appears in Realms of Valor, and that talks about how Jander faces his sire, the vampire that turned him into a vampire. There's one called Bloodsport, which is in Realms of Infamy, and that talks about him fighting a vampire-slaying bounty hunter. Then there's one in Realms of Magic called The Quiet Place, and that is about Jander's offered a divine gift. I haven't read or listened to those, but they're potential things you could check out as well. In terms of role-playing him, I'll be honest, I completely essentially stole his personality from another franchise. I and my players are big fans of Castlevania on Netflix, and I essentially just role-played him as Alucard, who is also a good vampire in that. Spoiler, sorry, for Castlevania. Although I think that's kind of the thing where if you read the description, or literally watch like 1 minute of one episode, you'd find that out. Apologies if people consider that a spoiler. So Alucard is a very cool character, and he talks in a very, let me see if I can do the voice. He talks in a very sort of calm voice like this. And this is how I roleplayed Jander as well. Very sort of sad tinge to his voice. He's lived a difficult life and undeath. and I just found that Alucard's voice really matched that really well. When my players met him in Dementlieu, I'll talk more about what happened in my game when they met him and stuff like that in a minute. He told them a story. It was just a quick, sort of like a mini cutscene of his life, about the events that happened to him, how he turned into a vampire, how he ended up in the domains of dread and things like that, which I will actually read for you now. And what I'll do as well is, I haven't done this yet while recording this video, but at some point I'll post on the Ravenloft subreddit with the text for this, so that you can read along, or read it separately, or you've got it essentially for your, if you wish to use it for your own purposes, whether you use it verbatim or tweak it. My name is Jander Sunstar. I am a sun elf from the Isle of Evermeet, in the world of Toril. Once I reached adulthood for my kind, I moved to the Sword Coast and became an adventurer. My friends and I were known as the Silver Six, and between us we defeated an evil red dragon that was terrorizing the region. While celebrating our victory, one of our party suddenly fell ill, then died. Then another, and then another. By the time we realized that vampires were behind the deaths, it was too late, and I was turned into one myself, serving a vampire lord named Cassiar. My sire was a cruel, cruel man. I tried my best to avoid hurting or killing anyone, but under my sire's control, I was forced to commit many evil deeds. It took a full century until I was able to defeat Cassiar with the help of a friend and become free world. For a time, I resided just outside the city of Waterdeep, living off animals in the woods. During one of my infrequent visits to the city, I met and fell in love with a woman with auburn hair named Anna. She lived in an asylum, and I used to visit her every day. While her mind was broken, her soul was pure. She was a kind and beautiful person. Some years later, she developed an incurable fever. I tried to save her by turning her into a vampire like me, but she refused and died. The next thing I knew, I was surrounded by an unusual mist. I found myself in a strange land, which I later discovered was called Barovia. I met the lord of the land, the vampire Count Strahd von Zarovich, and we struck what can only be called an easy alliance. I did not like the man, but I could not leave Barovia, and due to the unusual nature of the land, I could not sustain myself from its animals. In return, Strahd had only been a vampire for a century, as this was a few centuries ago, so I helped him to understand vampirism better. Eventually, the two of us fell out completely. I discovered the nature of his curse and that of Tatiana, and that's when I discovered the cruel truth. Anna was a fragment of a reincarnation of Tatiana that had somehow managed to escape the domains of dread and ended up in Waterdeep. Anna used to call me Sir, but then I realised she wasn't trying to call me Sir, but Sergei, mistaking me for her true love. With the help of a thief girl named Liesel and a half-Vistana priest named Sasha Petrovich, I confronted Strahd and tried to destroy him. I used the holy symbol of Ravenkind to shine sunlight on us both. Out of character, I was going to then have him say, he pulls off a glove to reveal his hand, which is burnt from the sunlight from holding the holy symbol. I was nearly successful in destroying him, but he used a spell to escape at the last moment. I thought I was going to be destroyed as well and would have welcomed it, but the mist surrounded me once more and I was taken to another domain. I can only assume that Sasha took the holy symbol and hid it somewhere. And that is my tale. After being spirited out of Barovia to another domain of dread, I decided to dedicate the rest of my existence to destroying other vampires, here amidst the domains between the mists. Hopefully that does him justice, and that might be handy for you in your games if you decide that Strahd kind of gives a mini info dump, lore dump about his background and who he is and stuff like that. Let's talk about the stat block. So in Foundation's Guide to Ravenloft, it suggests a vampire. Now, that's an interesting one for a few reasons. One, it's pretty strong. Two, it's got legendary actions. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Potential issues there. And three, I don't think it actually follows the 5e 5th edition lore on what happens to a vampire spawn when its vampire sire is destroyed. I thought originally that, say, for example, if Strahd got destroyed and the bride, some of the consorts were still alive, they would become vampires instead of being vampire spawn. But then a number of people told me, and I've kind of confirmed this for myself since, that nope, a vampire spawn is always a vampire spawn unless they feed off the vampire, like the whole classic thing of the vampire lets the vampire spawn taste some of its blood, and then it becomes a fully fleshed vampire. So technically, unless Jander's sire did that to Jander, Jander is actually a vampire spawn. Now, you might like this because a vampire spawn is weaker, and that might be a better suited ally for if you're having Jander join the party for a bit, for example. Whether, you know, some people might just treat him as a quest giver, some people might just treat him as a cameo, but some people might treat him as a, you know, an ally who, you know, maybe works with the players for a bit. That could be pretty cool. There's another stat block as well you could consider, which is the Nosferatu, which is from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. I'd probably say if you were going to consider doing that, to not use the Blood Disgorge attack, as awesome as and gross as that attack is. I don't think that really fits Jander's nature. So maybe save that for if they fight a Nosferatu who then actually does that, rather than have Jander do it and the players are like, oh dude, that's gross, that's weird. So in terms of legendary actions, if you do use the vampire stat block, I would suggest if you're ever in a situation where a NPC ally has legendary actions, don't use them, because it can really slow combat down, and this is a mistake I made. My players didn't complain or anything, but it was just maybe I'm being too hard on myself and it's something that I'm kind of overanalyzing. But when my players fought with Jander and then he used legendary actions to do additional attacks between turns, it just slowed down. It obviously meant that the players got less action, the players did less damage. When 2 of the times they worked with Jander, they fought enemies with legendary actions as well. So it was a bit ridiculous how, like, somebody had a turn, then I was like, then the enemy does a legendary action, then Jander does a legendary action, and then somebody else has a turn, and then the enemy has a legendary action, and then Jander has a legendary action, and so on and so on. So it might make it a little bit harder for the players, because obviously you're not using the stat block of this NPC ally to its full potential, but it'll probably just make the game run a bit smoother, and combat will be more fun, less of a slog if you take those out and just save legendary actions for enemies, not allies. With whichever stat block you end up choosing, one idea as well you could do, which is kind of true to the novel Vampire of the Mists, is Jander has a condition where if he touches flowers with his bare hands, they wither and die. There is actually a dark gift in Van Richten's Guide called Touch of Death, where if you do unarmed strikes, you can do additional necrotic damage. And one of the manifestations is, it's slightly different to Jander, but it's what gave me the idea, is that small plants die in your presence. You could just change that to say that Jander has this, and the circumstances are if he touches something without gloves, they die. So that could be a cool thing to include as well, have that in the stat block. Whether you use the vampire spawn, or Nosferatu, or something else again, you could consider adding that as an additional thing that happens. Obviously, it would only apply to, you could have it that it only applies to like plant monsters. So say if they're like, I don't know, if they're in a situation where they'd have Jander as an ally and fighting alongside them in battle, and they fight a plant monster, but Jander could be like, the gloves are coming off. Well, maybe not that cheesy, but you get my meaning. And then when he does his attacks, he also does additional necrotic damage, in addition to the regular damage he does while slashing or punching or whatever it is. Let's talk about how Jander appeared in my game. So my players had visited quite a few domains. They knew Rudolf van Richten from their adventures in CoS Strahd in Barovia. They met the Weathermay Foxgrove twins in Mordant. So they met quite a few of the Mist Wanderers mentioned in Van Richten's Guide, and just generally people that Van Richten knows and his proteges, including Esmeralda as well, who they knew in CoS Strahd. And then they had a reason to go to Dementlieu. So long story short, they have Lubus Torquer's souls. I've done another video that covers that. I'll do the thing where like a link or box appears if I can. And that magic item has a side effect where it can release monsters. And while at the Sea of Sorrows, they released Vampire, and I decided that it ended up in Dementlieu. And what was interesting is I didn't actually plan to include Dementlieu in our campaign, but because this happened, I did. And it ended up being great. I loved running Dementlieu. So like I said, that's probably going to be one of my next Ravenloft videos, if not the next one. And because Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove is travelling with the group, she said, some people I know, Alanik and Arthur, are in Dementlieu. We should visit them. You know, maybe we can find this monster that's escaped from the Tarokka cards together. So they go to Dementlieu, they find Alanik and Arthur, and Alanik and Arthur introduce them to their friend, who comes in and, like, I think he was either there during the day, or maybe he travelled there, like, I think they arrived at night, actually, and he just arrived in the evening, and they let him in, and they're like, this is Jander Sunstar. They introduce him as the sort of domain's expert on vampirism, and at first I was hoping my players would think, he's some sort of scholar. And then as he's talking, and like it becomes clearer that, oh, actually the reason he's an expert in vampirism is because he's a vampire himself, and they fought vampires. They fought Strahd and others, and so they were a little bit on their guard at first, but then Alanik and Arthur vouched for Jander and said he's a good vampire. He's managed to, you know, get used to not feeding on humans. I played it that he lived on Groch Island, which is a small island just off the coast of Dementlieu on the 5th edition map. He lives there, and there's a cave, and there's he feeds. It's just basically an island populated on rabbits, and he very occasionally feeds on a rabbit. So that's what I did. He explained that vampires are very vain creatures who love nobility and love that kind of lifestyle, and he said that he thought that the vampire would make its move at the next Grand Masquerade. So not only did they have to try and score an invite to the Grand Masquerade, or get into the Grand Masquerade by other means, I'll cover more about that in the Dementlieu video, but they also then had to try and identify the vampire and stop it potentially trying to become the next Dark Lord. You know, this aspiring Dark Lord trying to take down Sidra de Honair. So that was quite an interesting premise to have. And then Jander helped them. They did a few sort of mini quests while they were in Dementlieu. One of them was to stop a serial killer who was terrorizing the city. And he acted as bait, and they took that down. He was obviously limited to, he can only travel places to them at night because of issues with sunlight. So he didn't help them on all the quests that they did and all the time they spent in Dementlieu. He helped them with a bunch and then went with them during the Grand Masquerade itself. Then they went to the Grand Masquerade, they identified the vampire and stopped. And with Sidra, it was quite weird and funny having, instead of fighting the Dark Lord, they were actually working with the Dark Lord, trying to save the Dark Lord. It was a really strange, curious thing. And then they were still thinking, should we actually destroy this Dark Lord? Because she is pretty evil. And then they were like, nah, it's okay. I think they were a bit worried about her super overpowered disintegration attack. So they were like, no, she's not that evil. And they just left it to her. And at that point, Jander left them, went back to his island. And that's all they've seen of him so far. An interesting side note was just before they went to Dementlieu, they befriended a Deva who they met in Naranjan. I took this from PhD&D, does a great video on Naranjan. I won't say too much because feel free to watch it yourself and see for yourself. But they essentially saved a Deva, and she said, "Thank you, I owe you a favour. Maybe I can help you on an upcoming quest." And they had the decision: does she help them in Dementlieu, or did she help them when they returned to the Sea of Sorrows to finish things up over there? And they decided the Sea of Sorrows. So she didn't join them in Dementlieu, but I thought it'd be really interesting having this angel and this vampire as two allies. What would this angel think of Jander? I had it planned that she would maybe say, like, this is a creature of the night. There's no such thing as a good vampire. We should destroy him right now. And then there'd be some tension. And then potentially, like, they have to decide, who are they going to, like, work with? The Deva angel or Jander? And have that kind of quandary. In the end, it didn't happen in my game, which was a bit of a shame. But I just thought that was a really cool thing to add, and that kind of moral complication and quandary that it could have added. My future plans for Jander. Before I talk about those, I want to now talk about his controversial Descent into Avernus cameo. Again, warning for spoilers for Descent into Avernus. It's only going to be really brief spoilers that affect talk about, Jander and how Jander appears and why Jander appears, which I suppose kind of sort of wider spoilers to what the campaign is about a little bit. So just be warned. If you want to play that one day, maybe just skip this section or stop watching now. So Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus came out before Van Richten's Guide. And I guess the writers wanted to include a nod, a homage to Jander, because he is a beloved character. And the way they went about it, I don't like criticizing people. I know there are some people who say they hate it and stuff. I think it's just, how to explain it? I don't know, it just feels a bit harsh on Jander. It doesn't seem true to his nature. But essentially what happens is he joins the Hell Riders. I think in his lore, he was a member of the Hell Riders originally before going to Barovia. In fact, let me just double check that. Yes, I've just checked, and he was a Hell Rider before. So he was a Hell Rider before going to Barovia, and then technically also, I guess, a Hell Rider afterwards. And him and a bunch of people ride into hell. But I'll be honest, I don't know this campaign book really well, so it might be that it's in other areas, it's fleshed out a bit more and it's a bit more obvious. But my understanding is he has doubts, or he's quite cowardly, and he basically backtracks on the idea and he retreats. Again, that doesn't feel very Jander-like. And he is then punished for this by basically being stuck in one of the layers of Avernus, you know, D&D hell, and he basically begs for the characters to end him, essentially, which is just really sad and really tragic, and really like sad way to go. And what was interesting is in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, there's this whole thing, and I think a lot of people see it as some sort of like attempt at a retcon, where it talks about how Jander uses the apparatus in Mordant to try and cure his vampirism, but instead it duplicates him, creates myriad copies, and that appear in loads of different planes. And as a sort of attempt to retcon, maybe say, oh, well, the one in Descent into Avernus is just a clone. It's not the real Jander, or just one version of Jander. Not all Janders. Hashtag not all Janders are like as cowardly and, you know, pitiful as the Jander in Descent into Avernus. I ended up in quite a funny and weird and interesting situation, and I lamented about this on the CoS Strahd subreddit, where my players said they were considering, what it was I asked them if they played or were gonna want to play one day Descent into Avernus, and they said, oh, funnily enough, a friend of ours is thinking of running it for us. And I was like, oh no, they're gonna see the crap Jander. And then I posted on Reddit about this, and I want to give a shout out to, he's one of the most prevalent commenters on the CoS Strahd subreddit, MJDunn01. I don't know if he's watching this and if he remembers this comment, but he said, and I'm going to read it verbatim because it's a great comment. Maybe not totally locking in on your concern, but I actually lean the other way. Jander being in both places is a total WTF moment in a good way. Most likely the ramifications will play out in your campaign in Ravenloft, not in Descent into Avernus, because his role will be much more substantive and extended in mine. The players will obviously have questions, probably wondering, is this Jander's past or future? Answer, neither. You can slowly do the reveal to Jander's plight, but in the meantime you have players ripping out their hair trying to figure out what secret their PC's erstwhile ally is hiding from them. So I say, don't fear the Janders, embrace the Janders. So thank you, MJDunn01. That's an amazing comment. And I loved as well, embrace the Janders. I think that's my new favourite saying. May we all embrace the Janders in our lives, in our D&D games. But what this means is it completely changed my perspective on things. I kind of actually like the idea now that Jander appears in other places. And the ideas I have for him are that he appears in either Forlorn, which I think might be my player's next destination, or one of the next destinations after where they currently are in Valachan, which we're just finishing off at the moment as I record this. Or originally I had the idea that he'd appear in the Shadowlands. And the idea I had is it wasn't the Jander they met in Dementlieu. He's still there, he's just in the cave on the island chilling, eating the occasional rabbit. But the Jander that they see in either Forlorn or the Shadowlands is one of the copies and clones. And the idea I had was they would arrive, whether it's at the Shadowlands or Forlorn, and somebody says, we've got some sheep or animals, but something keeps coming in the night and stealing them, and you know, we think it's some sort of monster, maybe a werewolf taking them, can you investigate? There's this young woman here who will help you, who will be Savra Sunstar, and she'll explain that she's a dhampir and she's a vampire hunter, or monster hunter, maybe not give the game away too quickly. She'll say she's a monster hunter and she's volunteered as well to try and hunt down whatever this thing is that's stealing sheep. So they track the monster to the cave, they go in and they see this monster feasting on this sheep, and they see it's Jander Sunstar, and I can see my players being like, oh my god, it's Jander, we know this guy. And then two things happen that just will hopefully make them go, oh! One of which is Savra pulling out her sword and being like, I thought it would be you, father. And they're like, hopefully like, whoa. And then the other thing, Jander basically being like, not recognizing them and basically being like, I don't want to hurt you, but I will defend and protect myself. And then there's essentially a fight between Jander and Savra, similar to the artwork they show in Van Richten's Guide, where Jander, I imagine, would probably win. But he won't try and kill Savra, he'll probably just try and knock her out. And then the players obviously might be able to try and talk them down. Do the players attack Jander? The players attack Savra. All the time, if the players try and talk to Jander, he'll say, I'm sorry, I've never seen you before in my entire life. And then it raises the question that, like, you know, who is this Jander? And, you know, eventually they'll probably find out that they will, you know, that there are two Janders. If they then go back to Dementlieu and try and meet that Jander, Jander's like, no, I've never heard of the Shadowlands, or, well, we can't say he hasn't heard of Forlorn, because I think in the lore he did visit Forlorn. But anyway, they'll be like, no, you didn't see me in that place like a month ago or whatever, however long it was in game. And then what I like is if they do Descent into Avernus, And then their DM just says, oh yeah, okay, so you're walking to this place and you see this vampire, and this vampire who's stuck to this thing is called Jander Sunstar. And then my players are like, oh my god, we know him from another campaign. And then they will, you know, hopefully it'll help them connect the dots, and they'll know that like Jander is, you know, it's a copy of Jander, and they know because they know about the clones and the copies from my campaign. And then it's like that kind of beautiful thing of like my campaign's connected to this other campaign they're in, and it's all connected, and it's all, you know, I just think that's really exciting then. And instead of turning it into like this negative that I think a lot of people see it in because they don't like the cameo in that campaign, it just turns it into a positive and, you know, marries it all together and stuff. So I thought that was really cool, and I think that's kind of the way I'm going to go about it. And that's it for this one, I think. Have you run Jander in your game? Or are you hoping to run Jander? I would love to hear your stories or what ideas you have for where you're going to include him. I'd love to hear stories of people who included him in CoS of Strahd and in Barovia, how you went about that in a way that was satisfying. I've even seen some people go as far as considering making him the fated ally from Madame Eva's card reading, the Tarocca reading as well, which is pretty cool. Also, just to reiterate, I put out these videos as often as I can. Half of them I try and intersperse them. I do a CoS of Strahd video, a Ravenloft video, CoS of Strahd, Ravenloft, etc, etc. The next few Ravenloft videos I'm likely going to do are Dementlieu, how I ran Dementlieu, how I ran Valachan. And then NPC-wise, I'd love to do a video on Esmeralda or Ez, and Firan Zalhonen, or Firon, I think he might be pronounced, and we'll talk more about that in that video. And I think that'll do it. Thank you, Miss Wanderers.